And we're live. Hello,
Hey
everybody.
everybody.
So, yeah, sorry for the hour late stream. It was my fault. I got distracted with IRL stuff. But yeah, we still got stuff planned. We still got stuff to show. And, well, yeah, the kind of things that you're seeing right now, what we're going to be talking about, are going to be, have become increasingly relevant in the, increasingly relevant at this particular point in time, especially as the empire begins to collapse. Like I'm sure you've observed as well how the government has become increasingly authoritarian in both its structure and its appearance, and as well as its behavior. You have the 10,000 federal troops, or I'm sorry, National Guard troops in Washington, D.C., who you have Congress people now who are saying that they need to be there for as long as necessary, which means indefinitely. I remember seeing an article on Zero Hedge. I didn't read it, I just saw the headline about how those National Guard troops are going to be there until sometime in March, and there's a very good chance that this quote unquote state of emergency that they're going to want to use as a justification for keeping them there, it's probably going to be continued onwards into the foreseeable future, or at the very least, that's my anticipation. And with this in mind, it's also pretty indicative of exactly what I've been talking about in terms of the twilight of the empire. That this is exactly what it looks like. I haven't seen those pictures of Joe Biden's inauguration. If someone could send those to me on Discord, I would love to see it. But I would like to see a compare and contrast between people who showed up for Barack Obama's inauguration, people who showed up for Donald Trump's inauguration, and then compare that to people who showed up for Joe Biden's inauguration. What I'm going to
Yeah,
expect is that you're probably going to be seeing a couple thousand people in contrast to the hundreds of thousands for either one of those two. And they're surrounded entirely by National Guard troops. It shows exactly what I'm talking about in terms of how the projection of strength that they want to create, but when you look under the hood, you get to see like how fragile and weak they are. Where you have entire, where you have like federal, like national Congress people being claiming to be afraid for their lives because they happen to be in the same town as some weirdos with a Viking hat.
yeah. Interesting though how political institutions attempting to project an image of strength also always coincides with with an attempt to limit the amount of people at a
What's the
given
difference
venue.
between an
We got it. We,
IGR and
we,
a
But
we
bucket?
got a we got
Woohoo!
a super chat.
The bucket. What do circus animals and knickers have?
all
We
right.
don't feed the NIGR. Just like old dogs, we need to put knickers down. My new song goes NIGR, 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 NIGR,
Well, thanks for
NIGR,
the super
NIGR,
chat. But
NIGGR.
just what I was going to say is, well, I not entirely sure how much we need to elaborate on, um, why exactly the government is in this situation because we do this to great detail in practically every stream. TLDR, government needs to print money in order to create a political framework for a financial system. But in doing so, they needs to also essentially plan interest rates, credit, and supply chains. They need to prescribe administrative prices through said financial institutions that actually introduce this fiat into the market. I really shouldn't call it money. It's a bit of a force of habit. I apologize. It's not money because money is a commodity that emerges within local economies because everyone within that local economy doesn't have a specialized need for it. Everybody has the same utility for it and they exchange it as a way to obtain specialized goods. Fiat is not money because it is the only reason people exchange it, or the only reason that there is a perceived utility for fiat notes, is because the government monopolizes supply chains and makes people associate with it in order to obtain things in the white market, and in order to obtain a house, in order to legally in order to legally purchase land, or to obtain like a place to obtain things that you need to live. Which, by which I mean, if you don't do that, the government will harass you. That's what I mean when I say legally. But yeah. So a problem that this creates, as you know, many of you watching the stream know, is the business cycle, what's known as the boom bust cycle, not the business cycle. But in manipulating interest rates, people invest their resources around commodities that don't have any actual consumer demand reflecting that investment. They're just investing their resources around debt and loans that people have created. And that's, on top of the fact that a political economy itself manufactures incentives that aren't, that are born essentially out of limiting opportunities and limiting people's access to resources, or ability to use resources to ends that from their perspective would benefit them more. So yeah, as a result, governments have to also try to control production and people who are spending that fiat. But in doing so, they make it so there's just an abundance of fiat, which is only entered into a few hands. But at the same time, they're essentially all but ensuring that every other market, so basically every market that's not a Wall Street investment firm, is going to have a hard time functioning. That's the reason for the lockdowns. I mean, and that's something that the state needs to do in order just to sustain itself. That's, an overt contradiction. If you do one, it negates the other, vice versa. So yeah, because of that, it's safe to say, just that factor alone puts us into a crisis. It puts the U.S. government along with every other government in the world, because they're all connected together through a sort of global financial system by a series of different state-sponsored cartels. It puts all of them into a crisis stage, and because the political economy is in a crisis stage, we've seen essentially the boom not just of agorist thought, but agorist means being employed. Counter-economic networking, I should say. Which leads us smoothly into the subject of tonight's stream.
Yeah, I remember watching this video a while back. Unfortunately, I don't quite remember that much about it. Shall I put up the tweet first?
Yeah, sure.
All right.
Now, the tweet doesn't really have anything to do. Well, I mean, it's related to the subject of the video, but Telltale Atheist is, you've probably seen his videos. He makes videos criticizing religious cults, primarily the Jehovah's Witnesses and Mormonism. And he made this tweet, quote, "If I were a lawmaker," I mean, you can read it, but It's amusing because as I was talking with Heretic about before the stream started, statists seem to also be noting the relatively, at least from their perspective, concerning presence of counter economic networks in society. They're starting to become more prominent, and normies are noticing. And watching them try to wrap their heads around it and it is kind of amusing, to say the least, the implications of it. And that's what Ivan the Troll here is just saying. I mean, politicians still don't know how to deal with cryptocurrency outside of just lying about it and trying to uh, convince people. It's risky. Well, it's risky. You shouldn't invest in it. Well, yeah, you probably shouldn't invest in it because cryptocurrencies are not supposed to be treated as an investment. In fact, that's kind of the entire point behind cryptocurrencies is they're supposed to become a type of money um, in the through the subversion of the proprietary financial system. They're supposed to be a type of money that emerges in local economies. But yeah, another casualty of the states. So far, there seem to be three markets that are, that counter economic networking is relatively prominent in. On the local level, it just seems to be like agriculture and gardening. And that's to a lesser extent, that's kind of always been the way that it was because you can't really, the state can control white market supply chains, but people can just literally grow food. So counter economies for food is not really something the government could do something about. They can maybe create a political infrastructure around it. But if if you at any point in American history or just world history go to any sort of local economies, there is, and by which I mean like smaller towns or just neighborhoods within those towns, you can find gardens and you can find people willing to trade fruits for certain things that aren't really tied to the cash nexus. Of course, there's finance. Not necessarily the financial infrastructure, because that's something. It's not that wasn't really a wake up call to agorists, but a lot of people within the libertarian movement as well were under the impression that the reason that the Federal Reserve exists is because there isn't any sort of competition with it. And while strictly speaking, that's true that the Federal Reserve couldn't exist in a competitive infrastructure, what they failed to realize, or at least what they were attempting to identify, is the infrastructure that allows the Federal Reserve to exist as a state monopoly, as a political institution. And just creating cryptocurrency, as we've seen, is not going to start creating local economies, essentially, unless the the political financial infrastructure of a given area bottoms out and collapses, like we see in Greece or some of the rural areas in Siberia.
Mm-hmm.
And as a result, cryptocurrency has only been utilized as a speculative asset because the cash nexus still exists because of these manufactured incentives that are present due to the state's ability to manufacture a political infrastructure.
Now,
So,
sorry.
what were you gonna say?
I was just going to sidetrack a bit. I was looking at the chat, and George Hernandez did bring up in the comments, did bring up an interesting thing that is worth talking about, and that is r/Wall Street bets on Reddit. Did a thing with GameStop that really got a lot of hedge funds bleeding. Are you familiar
Was
with what
actually,
happened there?
yeah, I was actually considering mentioning that, or at least I was going to get into mentioning that. Are you familiar with it, or should I explain?
I'm pretty familiar with it. So my understanding,
All right.
admittedly, I haven't looked into it too closely, but my understanding is that what's his name? Uh, yeah, sorry. A bunch of hedge funds were making shorts against GameStop, which I'm sure you're aware is like the video game retailer. What a short means is that they're essentially making the assumption that the company is going to lose money. Now, the reason for that is not terribly important, but what happened is that collectively, r/Wall Street bets decided to pull a middle finger on hedge funds and just Wall Street in general, and just started buying up stocks on GameStop specifically to artificially drive up the value of GameStop, forcing the hedge funds to lose billions and billions of dollars. And now these hedge funds are, of course, crying mercy, are demanding that the state not only bail them out, but also make sure that that kind of manipulation cannot be done again. And of course, they're being blatantly hypocritical for doing so because, yeah, Wall Street's got is pretty infamous for the extent to which they'll artificially drive up and down the stock value of certain companies, certain commodities, specifically so that they can make money, as well as demanding that the state do that exact same thing so that they can make money. I mean,
Partners of the political class buy and sell stocks in order to manipulate the market value of certain companies. A system which exists, by the way, due to administrative prices, as mentioned earlier. That's not manipulation. That's just investment. But not people who aren't political actors pool together some money and do the exact same thing at the expense of these political institutions. That's manipulation, and everyone involved is a felon. Which, by the way, is probably what's going to happen.
I wouldn't be terribly surprised if they start making arrests. Now, yeah, it's another example of what I was talking about in terms of the twilight of the empire, where they want to project a great and powerful facade for how mighty they are. Namely, like these great and mighty multi-billion-dollar hedge funds are able to be brought down by a couple thousand people on Reddit just putting together a couple, maybe amount of resources that probably totals in the five figures, and they're able to bring hedge funds to their knees. What does that tell you about just how fragile the current political economy is? That a whole bunch of random people on the internet can just completely annihilate them.
Well, here's the thing. That's something that they always could have done. And the people in like apparently the original redditor who suggested the idea, his user ID is deep fucking value. Apparently he alone made $15 million out of this.
Damn.
So yeah, you bet this is about to become a trend of people doing this. And this is a great example of something not necessarily of agorist means, but something because we are of course still talking about the stock market. Um and it's not really going to do anything to the financial institution. In fact, one of the firms already got bailed out by the Fed. So, yeah, if they go under, new ones are just going to take their place, and the stock market is still going to exist because of the state propping up a system of financial planning. But yeah, this is an example of subversive activity being profitable and people engaging in that subversive activity, regardless of regardless of their philosophical or ideological stances, simply because it's profitable.
People are going to be engaging in not necessarily agorist praxis, although agorist praxis is included in this. They're going to be engaging in subversive activity against the state because it's simply more financially or psychically profitable for them to do so. That's why Esso and I have so much confidence that we're going to win in the end, because we can see the trends for how the economy is developing, how it is that people are going to be making money in the future, and how it is that people save money in the here and now. And we see that there is a definite trend towards subversive and or counter economic activity being the main means by which people start to make money and start to become financially independent. Now, I do want to jump off for a second here and address the comments. I see Zachary Cawley in the comments talking about how he left the back alley and he didn't respond positively to a screenshot involving, I don't know if I should say, I'm sure it's fine, but for his privacy, I'll go ahead and avoid saying it. But yeah, like no hard feelings at all. Nobody really holds anything against you. So if you want to jump back in, by all means, just let us know. Shoot me a DM. I'll send you an invite right away.
Yeah.
Mhm. And let's see here. What's he's? I see another comment by him. He's mentioned Coin Bureau. What's that?
Yeah, because I got to admit I'm not familiar with Coin Bureau either.
Yeah, he's mentioned like on the subject of cryptocurrencies. Coin Bureau mentioned GRT and other blockchain technologies, including Filecoin, that could potentially enable more decentralization. I'm not familiar with those, so I'm going to need some
Well,
articles or stuff talking about it.
what I was saying before we started talking about the situation on Wall Street today was just that in order for cryptocurrency to start being utilized as a type of money, the cash nexus has to be undermined. Because that's the reason that cryptocurrency isn't currently being used as a form of money. You can't go to, most people are still being harassed by the state if they try to compete with white market firms, or they try to associate with one another privately. The monopoly infrastructure on communication and commerce still very much exists. And until you can obtain, I don't know, a cheeseburger um, through the counter economy at a much better quality and much easier than just driving to McDonald's and giving them a few dollars for one. It can't become a type of money. Thankfully, doing that is not as difficult as it sounds, as firms like McDonald's are propped up entirely through state privilege and just simply eliminating the state's ability to set up barriers to entry would cause this to happen almost instantaneously.
hmm Now, anyways, should we get back to the video we're going to be talking about? Because this video is like 24 minutes long. There's like, even though this is a one of the longer streams we're going to be doing, there's very little chance we'll actually finish it.
All right. Yeah, sure. We can. Do you want to explain what it is?
First, I just want to address a comment by Night Watchman. He says, I wouldn't say profit alone is a good enough motive. The fact that it's the right thing to do will drive anyone with strong morals away from the state. Yes and no. Like, profit and morality are not mutually exclusive, of course. And people who have a strong moral conviction against the state, as anyone who seriously takes ethics, or anyone who takes ethics seriously should, but the two are not mutual. The two are definitely not going to be mutually exclusive. And even if you absolutely despise the state on a pure ideological ground and therefore seek to undermine it in your own life by doing whatever you can in your own personal life to subvert it, to minimize its impact over your life and everyone around you, that is still profit. Night Watchmen are. I don't know if you're familiar with the concept of psychic profits or not, but it does very much illustrate that people do perceive a benefit to themselves, if not financially, then emotionally, for doing things that they perceive to be in their best interest. It's why people engage in charitable donations, for instance, not because they actually perceive some benefit that they themselves will gain, but because it makes them feel good. It makes them feel good knowing that they're doing something in the world, and they probably even anticipate some reciprocal consequences will reverberate back on them and will benefit them at some point in the future. So yeah, there definitely is a profit in people doing things purely from the perspective of just wanting to do good. I'm hearing noise in the background. What's going on?
Yeah, Doug, please. Yeah, somebody was talking in the background here.
All right. Well, should we
Fine.
should we go ahead and get started?
Yeah, sure. Why not?
All right. It's a static image for like a minute.
Welcome to another
There it
episode of
goes.
In Range. I'm dealing with a topic that I haven't dealt with in quite a while here on In Range, and the reason for that is every time I put out a video like this, it was frequently met with a lot of vitriol and didn't seem to garner the understanding, I think would be the way I put it, that I was hoping it would. And here we are in early 2021, and I think we're at a point now where perhaps some of the audience that has felt that I was ill-guided or misguided may be having a different view at this point. And I'm going to get into that, and that's what we're going to talk about today. So nearly 4 years ago, I proactively demonetized the channel. I deleted my AdSense account and said I would no longer take any advertising revenue from YouTube whatsoever for my content. And I switched to a wholly and only viewer-supported model, currently Patreon, although there's alternatives. You can go straight through PayPal or others. Patreon being the primary one. And saying that the viewers would decide whether or not my work would continue. And I have to say I'm very thankful for that, and that has been successful, and that a lot of you have come through and kept In Range alive. But this video is not about a Patreon pitch, and this isn't a pledge drive. What this is 4 years ago I brought this up, and then...
Sorry?
Yeah, this is resident sleeper hours for sure.
Yeah, sorry. He's not going to be saying much for the first couple seconds, or in this case, the first couple minutes of the video. And
So I guess you could say, I guess we could comment about, and I'm sure this was actually missed by, I don't know if you caught this, but I caught this, how he was framing a disagreement in his sort of premise as a lack of understanding. So it's not that people had problems with his arguments on their merit because they lack explanatory power, or there are serious fundamental problems in some of the assumptions that he's making about how certain things work. It's just people misunderstood. I mean, people may very well have misunderstood, but that's not something. That's something that you demonstrate in your argument. You don't load your premise by claiming that someone misunderstood you. That's poisoning the well. It's something statists do a lot, and I have a feeling that a big part of the reason why that's so common in statist arguments is just because of how shallow and vapid attempting to argue something within a political framework actually is. You're not ever questioning your epistemology. You're just talking about things the state should prescribe onto society and policy preferences. there's no meaningful discussion that can be had there, because you're essentially reducing literally everything down to something that is substantively the equivalent of arguing over who the best Smash main is. And that's also the reason why people are driven so fucking crazy over talking about organization models or things that literally have nothing to do with them. A lot of people go crazy because they're coming at the discussion from within a political framework, and a political framework attempts to argue that every or the aspect of the society that is related to the discussion it is actually determined by policy, and the only way to influence policy is by joining a political party or spreading certain opinions. So, literally, if someone has a different preference or opinion from a political perspective, that's the equivalent of somebody having or having a doing something that threatens your own individual way of living.
Mm-hmm. I wanted to save these thoughts for a little bit later, but yeah, so I just want to keep going because I want to get through this first part, which is a bit of a slog. Unfortunately, I would fast forward. Unfortunately, I don't know when we actually get to the meat of the video, so we're going to have to kind of slog through this.
A couple, the same 4 years, but 2017, which is, we're getting there to 4 years ago now, I put out a video called Fahrenheit 451, in which YouTube and other social networks were mass deleting content, whether it was intellectual content, political punditry, etc., based on the whims of whatever the social norms were at the moment. It wasn't just firearms being affected at that point at all. It was lots of content. Essentially, anything that didn't make them that didn't strike the ire of their advertiser dollars and the usurpation of the old mass media over the new media was mostly left alone or ignored if they didn't know about it. But stuff that got in the way, it was gone. And as a result, we saw that the social media networks, YouTube in particular in this particular instance, had the ability to control the narrative. And in that regard, I made the statement that a lot of these social networks, whether it's Facebook or Twitter or YouTube, are the public square. And in regards to saying that, I meant, and I called for the idea of a digital Bill of Rights, in that it doesn't make sense to me that the Bill of Rights, as they apply to you as an individual walking here or in the public square in the actual meat space, MEAT, applies. Your ability to have free speech, etc., is protected, in theory, by the Bill of Rights. But for some reason, when you go onto the internet, which is completely and wholly corporately owned, all of those rights just disappear, poof, in a moment.
All right. Do we begin by talking about the idea that rights are somehow disappearing, or do we begin by addressing the digital Bill of Rights?
Yeah, actually, I don't know where to begin because there are a whole host of problems here, but sure. You can go ahead and start then.
All right. I think the best place to start is the idea of the digital Bill of Rights, which on some level I can understand, but not for the reasons that charlatans like this guy would probably think. Because on some level they are correct that it is a quote-unquote public square, because all of these big Silicon Valley giants are basically government agencies in all but name. You've done where's that meme you have of the snake being stepped on by the boot, and it has the names and logos of all those Silicon Valley corporations, and then it says,
I just linked it to you.
Yes. Yeah, it'll take me a bit to. Yep, there we go. That was actually a lot easier than I thought it would be. Give me a second here. Yeah, so the basic idea. Go. Yeah, sorry, I kind of lost my train of thought a little bit there. But yeah, we have covered the idea of the digital bill of rights in the past, as Zachary Colley has pointed out. Yeah, the thing about it is though, is although I understand where they're coming from a completely different perspective than what they're trying to do, in that but we can identify that Google, Facebook, Twitter, Apple, all of these other big Silicon Valley giants are, given the extent to which they benefit from and are controlled by the government, then the government has tremendous leverage over them, where their executive offices within these corporations are a revolving door between the state and the corporation themselves, to where the cash nexus, to where their credit ratings are manipulated, to where they are subject to antitrust legislation at any particular point in time. Should they fail to toe the line satisfactorily, should they, let's see what else here, how they are also subject to any number of audits, regulations, just basically the identification of the leverage the state has over them is enough to point out that these are not private corporations. They may be, legally speaking, corporate or private organizations, private firms. However, they are private in name only, and only like the flimsiest possible interpretation of that word. And that's why I refer to these organizations repeatedly in multiple videos as government agencies, because that's what they are.
And the problem with property standards within the framework of political institutions is that they entirely decide what counts as a just standard of ownership. This concept is also known as legal positivism, and to say that something is legally recognized as a private organization is almost completely meaningless, at least in
Now,
terms of attempting to identify their interests as an organization. At most, it tells you that the people who are managing the firm are not people that are employed by the government. That's about it. But even that's kind of questionable, considering that there are some private organizations like InQtel or the Federal Reserve who their board of directors are actually elected by Congress or are employed by the CIA. So that's even kind of a questionable standard.
yeah, and I bring all that to point out that I understand that, given our understanding that Facebook, Google, Twitter, and all of these other things are government agencies, that it would make sense from a purely constitutional point of view, assuming we're operating under the assumption that the Constitution is anything more than just a worthless piece of paper, that if we were to make that assumption, then yes, it would make sense that the Bill of Rights, or just the U.S. Constitution, would apply to them as well. However, that with that understanding, I'm still going to push back on it, ignoring the constitutional bit, of course, by just simply pointing out that by doing so, by imposing another policy prescription onto Facebook, Google, all of these Silicon Valley, I'm just going to refer to them as FANG collectively because that's how they're known in the investment community. What this is going to do is make it significantly more difficult for competitors to possibly come about. And I'm sure you also are familiar with this. I'm sure a good number of members of our audience are also aware of the extent to which the regulatory agencies and just the federal government in general uses legislation and economic restrictions to raise barriers to entry that make it significantly harder for organizations to rise to eventually be able to compete with the likes of FANG.
It's not just used to keep organizations out of sort of being prominent figures in the state's political economic framework. It's also as a way to control it. It's also a means of controlling the policies set by these firms within, by placing a degree of leverage over all of their resources by the state doing that, and also allowing the state to control their access to resources and how they can use resources, down to the price of these resources on the market, in order to sort of manufacture incentives. So it's to, I mean, a lot of people, the reason I elaborate so much when I go over this is that even a lot of libertarians don't understand the extent to which the state actually manipulates manipulates the market in modernity. And there's also another pretty common problem. Like it's to be fair, it's a very easy trap to find yourself falling into, of thinking that something, ethically speaking, can be more or less authoritarian, and that influences its organization model. No, material interests and the debt cycle influences the policies that are implemented by the state. The state is a class. The people who run the state are a class who, as being part of a shared organization, have the same interests as one another, and their interests are whatever it takes to keep the state's grasp on society for as long as they possibly can. So we really can't look at authoritarianism or coercion in a sort of prescriptive structuralist sense, where there's just sort of there's just sort of an organization claiming to have authority, and somehow from that political authority exists. No, it's a system of institutions which create, by using coercive means, a system of incentives that keep people into positions of dependence and put themselves into positions of leverage over other people, where they can seize people's property, and also control what counts as a just property claim. So when you understand that, you understand both why it's an absurdity to even conceive of a prescriptive system of quote unquote rights. At the same time, it's absurd to look at coercive acts as though they can be more or less coercive than one another, in terms of looking at the state and trying to analyze the interests of the state. In fact, this is a problem prominently that I see within the libertarian movement, and it causes people to sort of reconstruct cult of the omnipotent state mentality, where the state exists because people believe in it and worship it. What counts as a standard of belief? Why is that the reason that the state exists? It falls apart under light scrutiny, especially within a libertarian framework. But this is kind of important to call out, because it stops people. If you were to use this as the basis for coming to libertarian conclusions, not only does this actively disincentivize trying to approach analyzing, what the government's interests are and trying to, subvert their ability to continue functioning, but this also creates kind of a warped view of what an ethical society is. I quite regularly see libertarians saying things like, "Oh, we can't have a free society if statists exist, because statists will just recreate the state by believing in it." I'm just pulling my fucking hair out and thinking, Jesus Christ, this is why people think libertarians are utopian. No, that's not a libertarian position, and that's also not a proper way to think of the state.
Well, the state is a cognito hazard, don't you understand? In order to be able to get rid of the state, you need to mind control people into forgetting that the state ever even existed as a concept.
Yeah, ethical truths don't matter. It's not as though getting rid of these coercive institutions by subverting their ability to function itself entails people being able to defend themselves on an equal playing field with one another and being able to obtain resources and use their resources to pursue whatever specialized ends that they like. No, it's just an ethical society is when everybody is adjusting their own internal morality and actions around a certain set of beliefs. It's essentially giving up free will. That's what an ethical society is. Obviously, that's nonsense.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, back to this specific point, I guess in the video we were responding to. Did you have anything else to say?
Just to continue to remark on the fact that a digital Bill of Rights, especially if it's going to be written by state actors, because let's be honest, that's the only way it could possibly exist. You could come up with your own idea for what the digital Bill of Rights would look like, and I'm sure that there are several examples of digital Bill of Rights that have been drafted online somewhere, and I'm sure they're fine and well and good. However, it goes without saying that you have ultimately no control over whether or not that's the exact one that's going to be moved through the legislature and then signed by the President of the United States, or any number of things that could be drafted by the FCC that just might just be imposed upon people. But I can tell you one thing with absolute certainty is that Facebook, Twitter, FANG in general, they're not threatened at all by a digital Bill of Rights. If anything, it helps them significantly because it raises yet another barrier to entry in terms of preventing competitors from ever entering the market. Yeah, there are a lot of ways that already exist. You have occupational licensing, intellectual property, financial or credit ratings, and other sorts of stupid things. You're also going to have, of course, the benefits that these organizations get as content holders as opposed to publishers, where they are not subject to any of the actions of or any responsibility for hosting content that the state would otherwise deem illegal. Whereas if they were considered to be a publisher, that would be the case. And it goes without saying that any competitor that would rise up would not be subject to, in addition to all that, the various subsidies and the various benefits that they get from being partners with the state. And so they have tremendous economic advantages.
Oh, Jack Dorsey openly shills for it. Mark Zuckerberg openly shills for it in one of those like meetings that Mark Zuckerberg had with one of those hearings that he had with Congress. I can't remember exactly which senator brought it up, but yeah, Mark Zuckerberg openly promoted the notion of an internet bill of rights, and the fact that so many people actually saw the video we're responding to today is because Google promotes the shit out of content which argues in favor of some variation of exactly this position. So no, they're not only are they not terrified, they love it to the point where they actively promote it. Yet for some reason, people are able, despite this, to get to rationalize the notion that these are somehow against their interests. Also, just if you were to look at it, this from an analytical standpoint, this is obviously nonsense. Just sort of what I was talking about earlier with the state. A reason why why it's important to understand that the state is an organization and political authority is a position that exists in society, because an organization has essentially monopolized every aspect of society's infrastructure, land claims, finance, arbitration, security. The reason why this is important is because it makes it immediately apparent that legislative decrees do not actually restrict what the state can do or confine the state in any way. Legislative decrees are just directions essentially issued by the state, or things that police, the state's enforcers, should do, or the policies that the state's various political institutions should engage in. They're not things that stop the state from aggressing against you. Case in fucking point, the fact that people in many big cities are being picked up in vans and it's not known where they're being taken or how long they're being detained, nor is there really anything they can do about it. And that's kind of ultimately the point, that within the state's political infrastructure, they're going to do whatever they want to you simply because there's nothing you can do about it. You have no leverage there. So, given that this is the case, it becomes absurd to say that the state can break up monopolies, quote unquote, that the state created as a way of trying to consolidate more resources into a small number of political firms, as a way to try and track people's resources and manipulate incentives around them. It's even more absurd to suggest that legislative decrees can do anything other than construct barriers to entry or create privilege. Given that this is the case, the state intervening, that's in and of itself a bit of a misnomer, but I'll get to that in a second. The notion of the state getting involved in the market, getting rid of these problems, is absurd. That's in and of itself a problem. That assumes that the infrastructure we have, that assumes that the firms which do dominate the internet, that assumes that the incentives they all operate around are independent from the state. And that's completely ridiculous. In fact, the fact that network infrastructure, proprietary software, becoming a dominant model that software is developed around, and server infrastructure became proprietary. The fact that that even happened was a result of firms like IBM, Microsoft, Apple, trying to getting involved in the software movements and essentially recreating recreating the enclosure movement for digital applications by having the state come in and establish various types of IP or licensing statutes that said firms could use to legally aggress against other people for trying to use this same software, which previously was open for anyone to use.
Ooh,
I
we got
saw
another donation.
NIGR riding a bike yesterday and I thought it was mine, but when I checked the garage, it was still chained up asking for food.
Appreciate it.
Yeah, Nick Gers donated $2.
Bruh.
Yeah,
Well,
we're getting
for
comments.
the
Sorry,
getting
I was just gonna say
comments.
we're getting comments telling us to get back to the video.
Yeah. All right. Well, sorry for going on as long as I did. Both Heretic and I are. Heretic was talking with me about this before the stream, but you know, I'm kind of feeling the same way. We're having a hard time articulating my thoughts tonight, and Heretic's feeling the same way. But we're getting the point across pretty well, I think.
I'm sorry. My mind's starting to get warmed up a bit better, so I think I'm doing fine, at least for now. Let's keep going.
Because of this concept of the free market. Well, I started decentralizing my distribution of all my content to multiple different distribution networks. And at that time, one of the ones I recommended was, I thought, the best solution, and I still continue to think it is from a technological perspective, was BitChute. And the reason I thought that BitChute was probably the winner solution, at least the best one at the time, was because it was mostly decentralized, meaning that by using torrent technology, the ability for videos to get distributed and the cost of distributing those videos was dramatically reduced, and the overhead required to run something as large as the corporate oligarchy of Google and Alphabet Corp running YouTube has is diminished dramatically, making BitChute a very viable and possible solution. And the amount of funding required to run a solution like that is minimized. Now, if we decentralize better and had better technologies in terms of decentralization, we could maybe reduce it to close to zero. But over time, as I made these calls and made these statements and talked about Fahrenheit 451 and the burning of the digital library of Alexandria was one of the things that was quoted from me in Reason magazine, I saw a lot of people in the audience meeting my opinions with a lot of vitriol. I was called a communist, continue to be to this day, as a matter of fact, mostly for a lot of this kind of stuff, which is absolutely absurd. One would argue that the way I run InRange is far more capitalistic than the advertising model that most people support their content with. But
I mean, in fairness to him, I wouldn't dare associate him with Kropotkin. Yeah, I mean, I'm trying to remember specifically what the problem with BitChute is.
Well, it's not as decentralized as it advertises, and that's something that you, as I pointed out in a video that I uploaded around, I'd say the end of 2018, which as far as my content late 2019 is concerned, there aren't many videos from that time period I'd still recommend, but I think that one still holds up. Where I exposed Gab as being a honeypot. It claimed to be decentralized, and it had recently released an add-on to the browser called Dissenter, which sent all of your website information back to Gab servers and directed that to Google server traffic. But yeah, BitChute has sort of the same It's sort of the same problem. It's loaded with a bunch of Google trackers, and it's it's relatively federated, but that's not the they're using the term decentralization in a very misleading way, to say the least.
Well,
But what was that?
yeah, I'm just doing some reading right now. BitChute advertises itself as peer-to-peer. However, there's never been evidence of that. It's not even very well decentralized, because at one point, apparently, on November 22nd of, let's see, was it this year? No, it was in 2019. BitChute went down for 15 minutes, which, if it were a distributed platform, if it were self-hosted, then that kind of thing would never happen, just because one guy pulled the plug. So it just simply does not make sense. Now, is it
To
better?
say that something is decentralized within the context of an application is to imply a peer-to-peer model. It implies that you can just get on the platform, create a screen name, not even have to create an account. You just sort of are setting up your own local running instance of the program. It's always online, and it sort of it connects to other running instances of the application without a middleman. BitChute obviously has a a centralized server, and that's concerning, because that means on top of the thing that Heretic pointed out, where the website could that makes the website very vulnerable. But on top of that, it means that it's not a secure platform, because it has server traffic which can be tracked and monitored.
Mm-hmm. My thinking is that it's a honeypot. The fact that it tries to advertise itself so prominently as being decentralized and peer-to-peer is particularly alarming. It means one of two things. Either the people who are trying to run the site and are trying to advertise it know that it's not peer-to-peer and are deliberately trying to mislead people, or they have no idea what those terms actually mean and are simply operating on, at best, a kind of Ross Ulbricht system, where they kind of just hoping that their various centralizations and vulnerabilities don't come and bite them in the ass.
But yeah, the reason I call it a honeypot is because it seems, all of these platforms like Parler, BitChute, or Gab, they advertise themselves as being peer-to-peer or decentralized, even though they're obviously not. Although, to be fair, that's not something Parler ever claimed, to my knowledge. But a lot of them will try to make that claim.
I know that we're going to be talking about Parler in the future. It's just that they're going to be worth talking about, because although they don't claim to be peer-to-peer, they do claim to be more privacy-oriented, which, as we're going to point out, is complete and total bullcrap.
Yeah, but so what I was going to add earlier is they market themselves using the sort of, the sort of bingo words that would attract people who are skeptical of the government online, or are being promoted by their sort of controlled opposition personalities. We need a free speech platform, a First Amendment platform. Those sorts of terms are used to advertise it. And on top of that, these platforms are very prominent, and you can find them very easily, despite supposedly being subversive. So they exclusively attempt to appeal to the people. They sell themselves politically. So the only people who are going to be on the platform are the people that the government are wanting to keep a close eye on. They are, in some cases, more centralized and less secure than even competing platforms. And on top of that, they spread active misinformation about decentralization movements.
Mm-hmm.
So there are quite a few reasons, aside from the proof that we already have, which suggest that they are state-backed honeypots.
Mm-hmm. And there's actually I was actually doing a little bit of reading earlier in the stream, and there is a good amount of information that I think a lot of people are not aware about Parler that I think is worth disclosing, but I'm going to save it until he actually starts talking about it specifically. All right. So let's go ahead and hit continue.
I digress. And that they just kept saying, well, if you don't like YouTube, get off of it, don't use it. It's a corporate platform. You can go to another one. Well, sure. Can you go to another one? I guess maybe. You can't get people to go to the other one. I've tried now for 4 years, and the reality is 99% of my viewer base still is YouTube. And without that, I would not be able to succeed. So if I were to remove myself from that platform entirely, demonetized or not, the chance of my being able to reach an audience is diminished to near zero because, in my opinion, YouTube essentially has an oligarchical control, maybe a monopolistic control over video distribution content on the internet. And we see the same thing when it comes to conversations and just discussion on Facebook and Twitter. And so recently, of course, we saw a mass migration to Parler.
You want to say something?
Okay. Yeah, so this is something that also, this is a false narrative that gets promoted in political discourse. A monopoly is something that it is a condition in a market that exists specifically where barriers to entry are set up. And that the reason why that is the case is because in the absence of barriers to entry, people not only have an incentive to just go around a firm that they don't like and associate with another person or associate in a different model, but they have an incentive to do that, not just the ability to do that. But that is a valid question to raise. Well, to be raised. Well, why is that the case with online platforms? And quite simply, it's because the state has a monopoly on the server infrastructure. So the server infrastructure is set up specifically to manufacture an incentive for only associating with a handful of specialized firms, and any other firm which attempts to enter into that infrastructure, advertising traffic will be directed away from them. Not advertising traffic, but user traffic will be directed away from them. They can't get advertisers because advertisers are disincentivized from associating with those platforms because their credit ratings will be manipulated by the government. And then on top of that, the fact that that's even how a lot of firms are expected to report their returns. That's another interesting angle of this that I don't see a lot of libertarians talking about, is the fact that proprietary models are really not profitable. YouTube, for instance, for its entire existence, has never had a single quarter where it produced a net return on the money that it made. So, given that this is the case, why do they all operate around advertising revenue, given that advertising revenue is not profitable? And if you don't operate around ad revenue, then why is that something that disincentivizes people from associating with you? Well, of course, it's because credit ratings are set by the government.
Mm-hmm. Now, anyways, I want to get into Parlor here because, and by get into Parlor, I mean continue the video and let
Right.
this guy, I believe his name is Mark, talk about
I just
Parlor and try to
wanted,
hype it up.
yeah, sorry about the sort of redundant last statement, but yeah, this is a problem I see, and a lot of libertarians don't really seem to know, how to address this. I mean, it's a valid question, but yeah, why can't you just create an alternative? Well, it's because the state monopolized the infrastructure. So you got to subvert. You're looking the wrong way, or you're being misdirected within a misleading framework, essentially designed to bait you into being unable to argue against the statist. Because yeah, you can't compete with a competing infrastructure by setting up a different firm within that infrastructure. That would be like trying to compete with Walmart by setting up a competing level of management within Walmart.
Yeah,
Anyway,
that's just not going to work. And in the video, I just backed up like 3 seconds. So, anyways, let's continue.
We saw a mass migration to Parler and others, Parler being the most prominent one. And I have vocally said that I'm not interested in Parler and don't care for Parler because I don't really share a lot of the opinions that are being leveraged there. But the algorithm and the oligarchical control has made it so that it is nigh impossible for us as a community to have a conversation without just going to war with one another. And if you have a particular bias, whatever your bias is, the algorithm feeds you as much of that bias as you'll ever want and should need, and having a diversity of views and opinions in the world is something that's been diminished as a result of that, quote, God algorithm on all of these platforms. But that's not even what I'm here to talk about today.
All right, so he's not going to go into Parlor. He's just going into about algorithm stuff.
I haven't seen the full video, admittedly, so I mean, he may or may not talk about Parlor later on.
I did watch like I think halfway through the full video, but I don't remember.
But yeah, I don't know what else there is to be said about the algorithm because my previous comments essentially cleared that up. Well, yeah, when you're operating around a market infrastructure where what counts as a standard of profit is essentially being determined by a handful of political institutions, yeah, and you have platforms that work with one another in that infrastructure that have a sort of shared interest with one another. You're gonna get a relative hegemony on what's promoted by these platforms, given that the organizations in question all have the exact same interests as one another, and they have. In fact, this is down to being able to analyze what these firms' interests are and being able to sort of you can literally, if you understand it well enough, predict what they're generally speaking what they're going to do. I shouldn't use the term predict, but yeah, you can look at sort of where the firm is or where the institution is, and just based on that, what they're most likely to do next.
Yeah. Don't really have much more to add to that, so I'm just going to hit continue.
Here to talk about today, and all those topics, by the way, could be talked about in future videos. But what I am here to talk about today is the free market. And what kept coming to me when I said this and complained, or maybe I brought up issues is a better word, although people sometimes think it's complaining. I don't like to think of it that way. about YouTube was, well, just get off of it. It's a free market. Make your own. Well, okay, let's talk about that. Isn't that what Parler just tried to do? So let's go through the steps required in the current system that we live in today based on the internet and its intersection with reality. And let's discuss, do we actually have a free market?
I'm just going to go ahead and save you a whole lot of time and just say no. The fact that we have a central bank at all is enough proof that we do not have a free market. And we could go into probably a full hour, if not longer, going through in detail every single instance of the government intervening in the economy, even just merely existing, and how it prevents a free market from possibly ever existing. So the idea that we have, whether or not we have a free market, is kind of a foregone conclusion, because this is in the context of, could a free market ever exist in a society parasited upon by a state?
No, because
No.
the very first thing that a state does in order to establish itself is to try to create a political infrastructure, which I've been talking about throughout the last hour. Tying a bunch of economies together and trying to sort of create a sense of prescribed interests onto them by manipulating what they can or can't do with their own resources.
Mm-hmm. Now let's see here. Yeah, like, and also he's responding to a whole bunch of comments. We see this meme appear every now and then, and we know that there are some people who do genuinely believe that the solution is just compete with them, or that they're a private company and they're able to just do these things as they want. As we've explained previously, first off, they're not private companies, so that points to canard. And second, those that do genuinely believe that it's a free market, or at least a free enough market that you can't compete with them, are being unbearably naive, for reasons that we talked about previously. That there's quite already a very significant political and economic infrastructure prescribed to make sure that the state's friends and the state's cronies are receiving the benefits of their membership, and that includes protection from competition.
It would be more accurate to say that the solution is to subvert the infrastructure that exists, which is not the same thing necessarily as competition. So it's kind of in the same, I guess you could say it's kind of in the same spirit as competition, because it's the exact same means, except what competition is just when you're trying to profit for yourself in a market framework where there's more than one person providing that specialized commodity that you're producing. Whereas subversion is a deliberate analysis of existing organizations and acting in a way to try to make their organization model impossible.
Yeah, pretty much, and we know with absolute certainty that this is not going to be something that this guy's going to even consider. The idea of subverting these platforms, subverting their ability to organize centrally, subverting the very concept of intellectual property protection, is just something that's not going to happen. So he's just going to do that very basic bitch political solution, just saying like, "Ooh, just go out and vote for the people who are going to hold Silicon Valley accountable."
Like I said in the beginning of the stream, that realization is causing statists to lose their mind. And boy, we haven't even finished our project yet. No, it is pretty amusing to see people have have to consider subversion and consider looking at the state as an organization with systemic interests, because it's something that a lot of people are sheltered from in political media and academia, and it really is something that people like this probably haven't considered before.
Yeah, I don't really have much more to add to that, so let's go ahead and hit continue.
And I have purported the answer is no, and I'm going to go through the reasons why. And if we had a free market, perhaps that would be a good solution. However, I think that without getting too deep into this, all isms, capitalism included, with no form of regulatory control or mitigating factors, becomes another form of tyranny in its own right. And in this regard, the free market is wonderful until it's not. And then the free market doesn't become a free market. It becomes a closed market when monopolistic and oligarchical controls control almost all of the ability to have free speech, power, or wealth. And that's where we're really at when it comes.
This is why it's important to establish right off the bat that monopolies are something which could only exist as a result of barriers to entry. And that's not a conclusion or an entailment I'm promoting specifically just because that has to be true in order to negate the statist position. No, that was actually widely understood until the end of the 19th century, when, for political reasons, the state started promoting the idea that monopolies could form out of market incentives through unexplained means, whereas previously the state promoted monopolies under the guise of monopolies being a way to the state suppressing other market actors and competing models. That being ideal because the fact that this is the firm or this is the model that the state promotes obviously means that it's the more accountable model. But as for what he has said about, I'm not going to get hung up in his use of the term capitalism, because he made it very obvious that he's not referring to, or at the very least in concept, in his mind, his framework, he is not referring to things that the state has done, or he's not using it in the way that someone like Kropotkin or Kevin Carson would, which is to refer to essentially what we would both call the cash nexus, or incentives manufactured by the state as a means of privileging certain market actors within the state's political infrastructure. He's referring specifically to market actions and market incentives here.
And he has such a warped understanding of how things operate in an actual free market that he genuinely believes that the emergence of FANG as oligarchical institutions has everything to do with them just being big for the sake of, because they're big and they will always be big, and that's just how it happened, with no actual plausible or causal explanation as to how that came to be. The idea of monopolies existing for the purposes of protecting the state's friends and the state outright banning competition from it is probably something that's never even occurred to him. He has taken the mainstream view of monopolies that, if you just leave companies alone long enough, then eventually one will just become bigger than everyone else.
And that doesn't even make sense within his own framework, because he's also arguing that rights exist in a prescriptive sense. So how can something be tyrannical if we're not looking at ethics from the perspective of systems and reinforced incentives created through coercion and what that does to society.
Yeah. Now, it goes without saying that once you operate under this very rather lack of understanding, that he is clearly demonstrating, that you're going to come up with all sorts of very unusual conclusions, and the solutions you're going to try to come up with for this problem that you're not even able to accurately identify is just going to become really laughable. Anyway, should we continue?
Yeah, sure. I mean, there's a lot that could be said here, but it's kind of difficult to know where to begin because he's not really laying out an explanation, and even an attempt at an explanation. Very much like somebody coming to the argument from a political perspective, he's just sort of making declarative statements and expecting people to just kind of nod along, and whether or not they get it is not it's something that's just sort of inherent to the information he's presenting. Somehow he doesn't have to lay out context or demonstrate why he's right. If this is how he argued in his video from 2016, well, it's kind of obvious to see how people might have misunderstood, I guess. But
Yeah.
still, as we're pointing out, what you're arguing is we're not even halfway into the video yet, and I can assure you I understand full well the point you're attempting to make. And it's not that I don't understand you, it's that I've heard variations of this argument in different subjects hundreds of times, and I have even more ways of responding.
Yeah,
because there are so many problems.
it's really nothing new. So, anyways, I'm just go ahead and hit continue.
When it comes to the internet. So in that regard, let's go ahead and say you want to be a alternative to Facebook. You're not going to be Paul, you'll be something else, but you're going to do this. Here's the way you would have to do it for you to be able to succeed and not have some corporation block your ability to do so. So first, start a bank. Don't worry about this social network. That comes way later in the game. Start a bank. You need to be able to do credit card processing. Probably almost all financial transactions on the internet, with the exception of Bitcoin or cryptocurrency, go through credit card processors. However, Bitcoin's another problem for another video for another day, and it doesn't wholly solve this either, because you have to be able to turn Bitcoin into real money. But let's talk about that later.
No.
Turn Bitcoin into real money.
Jesus Christ.
We are dealing with a moron here. So I remember saying earlier that, or he said earlier that he had audience members calling him a communist, and I said I didn't want to do that because that would be comparing him to Kropotkin. Yeah, that's exactly why. Even commies are not this dumb.
Yeah. I don't know. I guess it would depend on the commie, because some of them, quite a few of them actually, particularly of the Marxian variety, do definitely promote the idea that money is just something that the state creates.
Yeah. And I'm not saying like Marxists aren't that dumb. I differentiate between commies and Marxists.
Yeah, as for that understanding of money, that money equals fiat, I'll be charitable, and even though he didn't lay this out assume that he at least considers gold or silver to be a type of money. That in and of itself has some problems that I'll get to in a second. But the idea of fiat equaling money, which, by the way, this in economic theory is known as charterism. Yeah, there are a whole host of issues with that. Why does hyperinflation happen? How come money emerges in economies where commerce is literally outlawed, i.e., inside of prisons?
Potatoes, that's why. Or I guess it's because cigarettes, when they're used as currency inside of prisons, they only become money because people believe that it's money. It's just that like it's kind of like in Warhammer 40K, you have orcs who are able to alter reality just by believing something is true hard enough. Vehicles go faster when you paint them red because they believe that they go faster when you paint them red. And the same is true with money.
Why
It just creates a similar uh, psychic field where people's belief is enough to grant it supernatural abilities that other commodities simply don't have.
Why does utility seem to affect whether or not something is adopted as money in economies?
Belief? I mean, people just believe it has utility, therefore it has utility, therefore it's money.
But that was such a fucking nuclear take that just came like flat out of nowhere. I don't even remember what he said before that now.
I mean, it's kind of like a glaring. It's very easy to miss like what he said before. I don't even think it was that important. Oh wait, I remember now. He was talking about if you wanted to create your Facebook alternative and you didn't want to have to worry about being shut down.
Create your own bank.
Yeah, create your own bank.
Which nice attempt, but still no cigar, because that even you arguably have even more leverage placed over you by the state as a financial firm operating in the political economy.
I mean, I think I've said before that I have family members who work in a bank, not a large bank at all. It's like some very small bank, like some small local bank has like 3 or 4 branches across the country, and they're subject to just an absolutely absurd amount of restrictions and oversight and just the amount of crap and pointless nonsense that needs to be done for the sole purpose of being compliant, that it would not be an exaggeration to say that they can't piss without some bureaucrat telling them when, where, and in what direction they need to piss. So, in addition, there's also a series. They're also occasionally, and I say occasionally, I mean like every now and then. By every now and then, I mean like basically every Tuesday, subject to entirely new regulations that are not on the books at all, but they're just experiment. But the bureaucracies are experimenting with them to see what happens. And so they're not only subject to the full financial oversight of the federal government, but also, in addition, they're subject to oversight rules that don't even exist. Literally don't even exist. So you're talking about one of the industries that is the most heavily controlled and regulated in the United States, with the exception of nuclear power and arguably healthcare. So, no, in terms, if you're trying to avoid a corporate oligarchy and trying to avoid being subject to government control, you're avoiding Amazon, but you're ending up in North Korea. Good work, dumbass.
Wait, heretic, you're telling me that regulations exist which aren't legislated? Almost as though state intervention is simply a show of power, and what they write down on pieces of paper have nothing to do with the state's actual ability to express power like
Yep.
that.
Yep. And take a guess what happens if this small local bank tells those regulators who are openly demanding that they comply with regulations that don't exist. Imagine what happens when they tell them to go take a hike.
I don't even really want to, but I can think of a few things.
Suffice to say, the government has tremendous leverage to pull out that kind of nonsense. So, anyways, let's go ahead and hit continue and see what other steps he needs to take.
So first, you want to start a network that's going to be a free speech network that will not be squelched by any other corporate interests or powers. Okay, 1, start a bank. Make that bank successful enough that it's accepted worldwide to be something that can actually do fiduciary transactions with other banks, because there's a pretty small chance that everyone that you're going to do financial transactions with will be in your bank. So there has to be a relationship between your bank and the other banks. Now, next, start a credit card processing organization and get that credit card processor to be accepted across the board, just like your bank. And here's why you need to start there. When Subscribestar first kicked up, which was theoretically an alternative to Patreon, which, by the way, I'm not on it because I don't trust its origins. I think it's a Russian kind of scam company, but that's another topic for another day. They essentially almost failed right out of the door because PayPal prevented their ability to process transactions. So PayPal became the deciding factor on whether or not Subscribestar could essentially be effectively functional.
And the
Very
FDIC is the deciding factor on whether or not PayPal can accept a firm to associate with it.
And you also have Operation Choke Point, which nominally has been discontinued, but I think we all know that there's nothing more permanent than a temporary government program. So we can pretty much just assume that that's.
We just established that since that infrastructure itself existing means the government has the ability to do this. And yeah, Operation Choke Point was just a policy directive given to the FDIC. Every time you see one of these, every time you see a political dissenter or some even controlled opposition firm being quote unquote deplatformed by the state, that's because they can't associate with a credit card processor or a server host. That's what's really happening. What's really happening is behind the scenes, they're having their credit ratings manipulated so that if they continue associating with that group, they won't be able to, they won't be able to make ad revenue because advertisers will also be at risk for associating with a low credit rating organization.
Yep, and they'll be able to, and you're making yourself subject to credit cards and associating with credit cards is going to create yet another area of vulnerability, because Visa, MasterCard, American Express, those businesses are going to have pressure put upon them by the federal government to not associate with your particular payment processor. Now, this wouldn't be a problem if you're going to be exclusively a cryptocurrency processor. However, I can't imagine that this guy's creative enough to come up with any solution that doesn't already exist in the white market. So, yeah, that's unfortunately not going to be happening. At least not with his ideas.
All of the competing explanations for why that happens don't pan out. It's not profitable to associate with firms like Subscribestar. Well, no, obviously that's not the case, because people are practically screaming for some sort of alternative to, or some sort of competitor to the other firms. So there's obviously a demand for it. All of these corporations just being woke SJW libcocks. Well, on top of that not being falsifiable, as there would never be any standard of proof able to be used that would count against that theory. The other problem with that, though, is it assumes that these multi-billion-dollar corporations all of the sudden, just when it comes to other firms, even though they are materially profitable, and in order to continue existing, according to the people who promote this idea's understanding of what a firm has to do, like what the interests of a private firm are, because this theory entails the notion that the government has nothing to do with that aspect of the market, and the government's not involved in any way. In order to make this case, you have to argue that there's a difference between the interests of these firms and the government, and their interests are exclusively to profit in a material sense. They're starving themselves of profit to engage in a behavior that, even according to this analysis, they would have no interest to do. Now, I've seen some clever people cite psychic profit as an attempt to substantiate that argument, or substantiate the reason for why this supposedly happens. And the problem there is that, for one, psychic profit is extremely limited in terms of the utility that it possesses, or at the very least, it's kind of difficult to point to something counting as psychic profit. That's in order to argue that they're operating around psychic profit in this sense, would be to insinuate that it's possible to prescriptively model human incentives, which would run into conflict with the Austrian economic theory. But the other problem that creates is that expects us to believe that these people have so much psychic profit that they're willing to sacrifice potentially millions of dollars just to meet their psychic profit. As organizations that require obtaining more fiat as a resource that they need to sustain themselves, and that every single person in all of these organizations have the exact same not only beliefs, but a way of internalizing those beliefs, and the exact same psychic profit.
Mm-hmm.
It starts to lose credibility as an explanation, simply because of well, aside from the fact that it's not falsifiable, it sort of becomes obvious that this can't work as an explanation, just because of how many ways in which you would have to suspend your disbelief in order to actually promote this. Suspend your sense of disbelief, I mean. This explanation runs into conflict with its own premises and its own explanation of what the interests are of these firms. In so many ways, it's kind of ridiculous. Yeah, let's continue.
Mm-hmm.
A month ago or so, there was an outrage about some illicit and illegal underage content on Pornhub, and we saw credit card processors threaten Pornhub to make it impossible for them to do fiduciary transactions, and they just wide swath deleted a massive amount of quote-unquote verified. Maybe their verification processes should have been better, but a wide swath and massive amount of content off of their networks that was crowdsourced or crowd-provided, or individual content creators, having an impact on the financial ability of those content creators to now succeed based on what they were creating. Now, when I posted a post about this on my Facebook wall, it was met with a lot of pearl clutching and a lot of panic attack about that I was defending pornography. And I don't really care what your opinion on pornography is, and I don't really care what you think my opinion is on that. My point was not about defending pornography, and it certainly wasn't about defending the abuse of underage people. What it was about the credit card's fiduciary capabilities to control a content distribution network. So we saw it with PayPal and Subscribestar. We now see it with Pornhub. And by the way, that type
I'm sorry, that first response was kind of funny. The Coomer meme.
I don't find the Coomer meme particularly funny.
Yeah, all right. It's because the reason that made me laugh is because this guy's beard kind of resembles the Coomer's beard. So it's funny because it actually kind of looks like him a little bit.
Kind of. You just need to take off the sunglasses so we can see his bloodshot eyes.
But anyway, continuing.
I mean, the question is, does he inject serotonin directly into his bloodstream? Anyways.
Of illicit content actually was more prolific, or is more prolific, on other networks than it was on Pornhub, like Facebook. But oddly, Facebook's not getting hit with the same threats that Pornhub is and was. Once again, I believe that to be pearl clutching.
Didn't Twitter recently get identified as hosting lots of child pornography directly on it? And they said that it didn't violate, and they decided not to take it down because it didn't violate their terms of service.
Yeah, what's up with that? It pokes a massive hole in your theory here.
Yeah. Don't really know. I mean, I can try to make them speculations, mostly related to CP being entirely selectively enforced, mostly against organizations and platforms that the state doesn't like. I mean, I'm pretty sure the reason that I'm pretty sure the reason
because Joe. Heretic, it's because Joe Biden's president now.
Yeah, but the Pornhub thing happened before Joe Biden got inaugurated.
I was talking about Twitter.
Ah, right. So I think with Pornhub, the reason that they were targeted is because a lot of channels, particularly gun channels, that were being kicked off of YouTube started hosting their content on Pornhub. And because the state wants to censor that entirely, they targeted Pornhub specifically because they're also a centralized proprietary platform. And so they did that through the manipulation of credit ratings. And yeah, that forced them to have to dissolve or like remove 90% of their content. Not just like the gun videos, but also a whole lot of amateur porn that was done through people who weren't involved in their partner program, whatever the hell that is. And as a result, yeah, they've kind of been forced to Tumblr their entire platform.
That was becoming kind of a meme. People being banned from YouTube and going to Pornhub as a way to get around being banned.
If people did that unironically.
Let's continue.
Yeah, one moment, please.
Based on the content. On the content that is there, not the actual problem. So, but we see here a credit card company essentially being able to hold a stranglehold on a content distribution network based on what is a somewhat arbitrary statement in that this is a problem that's across the board on the internet, and should Pornhub do better? Yes, but the reality is they're able to control them now. So we see Subscribestar,
sorry.
Pornhub, we've seen others.
You don't know how tempted I was for like a second there. Be like, yeah, there was this good porn I found on Pornhub that got taken down. So I I know that's pearl clutching.
I mean, I do know that, particularly among the alt-right and just like the white nationalists in general, that they're very pearl clutchy about pornography, very much interested in banning that.
that it's a tool created by the Jews to manipulate people into having shorter attention spans. Have you seen that debate between Styx Hexenhammer and some quack doctor who promoted that theory? It's kind of funny.
No, I didn't actually.
Because he says that exactly that what I just said was not in any way an exaggeration of their argument or a paraphrase in any sense. So, and he says that just with a straight face. And that's the position I'm expected to take seriously listening to them.
Mm-hmm. And I'm kind of thinking that my own response to that exact line of inquiry is that I'm going to need to see some evidence for that. Although I can't wait for Styx Hexenhammer to produce that evidence, or I can't even expect him to make that comment because we're still waiting on him to produce evidence that Donald Trump is engaging in 76-dimensional chess.
Styx wasn't the one who claimed that; it was the person he was debating against.
No, I mean, like Styx mentioned that when he was debating Stefan Molyneux on Donald Trump, and
I was talking about Jews creating porn to make people dumb, though. That's not something Styx ever argued. That was the position
right.
he was trying to argue against.
Yeah, you're right. I think it was just I think I just wasn't clear when I was trying to say that I can't expect. I'm just saying I can't expect Styx to be particularly interested in providing evidence on claims because he himself has made some pretty retarded claims. Anyways, I'm just going to go ahead and continue.
All right.
Besides this before, but right now, as of just a day ago, maybe it's today, I don't even remember, it's extremely recent, we saw Stripe pull the ability of Trump to fund his rallies and his ongoing endeavors, whatever you want to make of those. So Stripe just said, you don't get to do this anymore. And their entire website was based around doing these transactions through Stripe. On top of that, after Stripe did that, we're now seeing other credit card processors do the same. So what we see here is, I'm not here to argue if you agree or disagree with the actions of the Trump campaign, et cetera. That's a whole nother problem. What I am here to say is that you're seeing the credit card processors at a high level of control being able to decide whether or not you're able to fund a project. And we see that not just currently with the political situation in this country, but we saw it with Pornhub, we see it with Subscribestar, and we've seen it with many other things. In fact, we saw that with firearms manufacturers years ago, in which firearms were labeled and essentially thrown into the same bucket with sex workers and drugs. And as a result, credit card companies and banks would suddenly freeze the accounts of firearms manufacturers. This still happens today. And suddenly one day you go in and your company can't do anything because all of your money is locked up, and you have to find some independent third-party small bank that will take higher risk with you because you're dealing with a risky business, and as a result probably make less money, pay higher interest rates, etc. That's been going on for a long time, and it's continuing to go on. It goes on, by the way, in the legalized medical and recreational marijuana industry. Credit card processing for that's a problem. As a result, they have to deal in only cash. They get sometimes robbed because they have a lot of cash laying around. Anyways, all of these things.
It happens with literally any white market business, because to be a white market business entails having to associate with white market financial firms, which can be which can have their credit ratings manipulated by the FDIC, because the government also controls the fiat that they're using, the supply of it. And whose hands it enters into through the market.
He posted a screenshot from the Wikipedia article of Operation Choke Point, where it says that it's a Department of Justice program that was exactly as he described, but at no point does he mention federal government, FDIC, Department of Justice, or any of the other parties that were actually responsible for it. And the insinuation is that, this is just Operation Choke Point was just something the credit card companies or the credit payment processors did on their own. which is I find to be incredibly dishonest.
Yeah, I guess I'll hold my judgment to, hear him out, because I'm hoping that that's not the point that he's trying to make here. Because that's like water is actually dry kind of absurdity. Anyway, should we continue?
Yeah.
Come back to one source, which is the financing and credit card company processors. So if you want to have a free speech platform, 1, make a successful bank, piece of cake. 2, make a successful credit card processing company accepted worldwide, piece of cake. All right, so now you've got your bank and you've got your credit card processor. It's now time for you to spin up your new platform. So you start getting your content created. You now have to host that somewhere. You not just have to host that somewhere, you have to host that so that it is load balanced essentially worldwide. So like, for example, so many times we saw alternative video distribution networks that their heart's in the right place, but when you go to watch the stream, it runs like dog shit. You can't view it on any reasonable internet connection. And that's because they don't have the reach of YouTube doing, first of all, massive algorithmic compression, but they also don't have a large globally distributed content distribution load balancing network that brings the content closer to your internet connection to allow your little tiny crappy internet pipe, of which, by the way, US has some of the worst internet in the world, getting to your network connection, being able to actually view the video or the content in a reasonable way. So
do you
now
know why?
you need to find a place to.
Sorry.
You know why I was gonna say, yeah, and do you know why the United States has one of the worst ISP infrastructures in the world? Because it's one of the only places where the government directly manages those firms through zoning laws, and in most other places, take India. India is sort of the primary example. The reason why it's so, the reason why so many like robot callers are from India, and why tech support's outsourced to India, is specifically because they operate around not a decentralized infrastructure, but basically the emailing system is not proprietary there. They have a different network protocol, and most other places were able to adopt some sort of standard like that before the state got involved with trying to manipulate what tech firms could do. But as for the US, yeah, this is again only a problem because there's a proprietary server infrastructure, and it's particularly a problem in the US because of the privileged status that the ISP market enjoys. In many places, there's just straight up a monopoly on ISPs.
You have a very interesting position. I think I remember covering this like 2, 3, maybe 4 years ago when I was doing videos responding to and like criticizing the idea of what's it called? Net neutrality. That's it. And I pointed out that yeah, there is a tremendous amount of regulation, a tremendous amount of legislation and hoops you need to jump through just to get an ISP started. How just in a suburb of Seattle, Washington, that Google Fiber was having tremendous difficulty getting their own proprietary ISP up and running. Google, one of the biggest companies in the world, can't get an ISP started through frickin' local regulations. What does that tell you about how centralized and controlled and restricted internet service providing actually is in the United States? I think it's particularly. I think it's. Yeah. Now, of course, this guy also doesn't have the imagination to come up with an entirely decentralized network infrastructure that's entirely self-hosted, because he wouldn't think to do that. And I don't think he's even aware that that kind of model of organizing exists. So naturally, he's going to be trying to do things through the good old-fashioned way. Of course, I say that with all due sarcasm.
But yeah, and the reason we point this out is just because it seems unavoidable that this is an infrastructure problem, and it's an infrastructure problem which exists specifically because there's a political economy dictating how an infrastructure has to exist. Every single economy, everywhere.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, should we continue?
Yeah.
To put your platform and spend a lot of money, whatever your opinion is. If your hot take is that your network is all about the quality of pizza with pineapple on it, there's going to be someone that's going to try and denial of service attack you or DDoS you, because that's how the internet works now. So you have to protect your content and your server infrastructure to make sure that it doesn't get taken down by your opposition. So now you probably need to have some sort of DDoS mitigation solution. You have to have a load balancing solution, of which we've seen that being typically Cloud Shield is the predominant one. And guess what? We've seen them deplatform people that they have issues with. Now, your next step, you have a bank, you have a credit card processor, build a globally distributed content load balancing network that has DDoS mitigation solutions built into it.
All right. I just find this amusing. So, step 4: build global anti-DDoS mitigation solution.
Mitigation. It's mitigation.
All right. So,
but yeah, again, that's only this is only a problem that exists again because of the fact that there is a proprietary server infrastructure. This is akin to almost to arguing that if you're gonna try and compete with big pharma, you got to start your own insurance firm.
pretty much. Not to mention that there are other network models that would make DDoS a non-issue. I can't speak with any expertise on these at the moment, but DDoS is primarily a problem because of the way that the internet is structured today.
Literally, if there is no server, there cannot be a DDoS attack.
Mm-hmm. Which makes the suggestion I made earlier of having everything be hosted locally, your entire network, and you having your entire website be entirely peer-to-peer, would make it so that the only way to DDoS your website is to DDoS literally everyone who is hosting an instance of the website simultaneously, which I don't think anyone's going to be able to do ever.
Yeah, there are so many problems when you actually start scrutinizing a proprietary server model, which start coming into focus that actually could be circumvented through existing network protocols or hardware. That it becomes kind of obvious just by looking at incentives that there's no way that this infrastructure could exist in the absence of barriers to entry. But the fact barriers to entry exist sort of explain why people have to settle for what we have, because the state will just simply harass people for trying to do anything different, or will manipulate firms' credit ratings so that people can't sustain certain firms. But anyway, should we continue?
Yeah.
Global. You need this to be global. At least you need it in the U.S., Europe, Africa, Asia, the main consumers of this content. You probably don't need it in Greenland, okay? But you need to have this pretty much global. Cool. So now you've got all that. And somehow you've done this without the internet providers on the backbone taking you down. So you have to put this infrastructure on a internet provider, probably a backbone provider. There's a small handful of them that actually run the actual core of the internet, and then there's a couple tiers below that. You have the backbone, and then a couple tiers below that. You can probably work with any one of them, but if you were to garner the ire of any one of them down the tier, there's a good chance you'll be dropped off the internet anyway, or blocked, or firewalled, or black holed. So I'm not going to get to this point, but maybe you need to create a backbone internet provider at this point, because the handful of them might take ire to your content. I don't know. That hasn't happened as much, but it's certainly possible. And that's where the concept of network neutrality comes into, which also I've been lambasted about, but let's put that aside.
He's supporting net neutrality too. Good Lord.
That doesn't surprise me at all. Yeah, I have a decent video from early 2018 criticizing net neutrality or going over problems with it on my channel. But essentially, the problems in concept with the so-called digital Bill of Rights exist. The same problems exist and are present when talking about net neutrality. Net neutrality at most is just a different incentive for firms to at the very most it gives them a different it creates barriers to entry and creates certain privileges to incentivize firms who all have the same interests as one another to operate around a different coordinated set of interests. To think that that's somehow that puts them at a greater position of leverage over the average internet user. So to think that a net neutrality decree is anything other than a position, than another layer of privilege added onto these firms is kind of ridiculous. It seems sort of obvious at face value what net neutrality is, what a net neutrality policy would be designed, who it would be designed to benefit. It would benefit people who have to spend more on maintaining their network infrastructure. We have a proprietary because we have a proprietary network infrastructure that the state defends, and which people like Google or Facebook or Twitter strongly benefit from. Oh, well, it means that they have to pay less in order to maintain their overhead costs.
It's kind of funny how every time he tries to articulate a position, he also needs to frame himself as a victim by saying like, "Oh, I'm getting lambasted in the comments for having all of these dumbass hot takes." Well, yeah, of course you are, because everything you're saying is so idiotic. Even white nationalists are calling you out for being dumb.
Yeah, as far as normies go, a lot of the stuff that you're arguing, people are becoming increasingly skeptical of. Even on even around like the MAGA crowd and the more reasonable Marxists, those being the ones that you can talk to who won't screech at you for not being a Marxist. They're starting to identify the fact that there's an infrastructure problem as well. So they may have competing explanations for what is the cause of that infrastructure problem. It's becoming because of what the government is doing, there's a healthy skepticism towards what the interests the government would have in getting involved in such a practice would yield, which is why people who promote net neutrality have to promote it within factually with factually inaccurate information that is also oftentimes self-contradictory. For instance, the notion that net neutrality was first decreed in 2015, but also their argument that it's the early internet can be explained by net neutrality being present in the 1996 Telecom Act. Which one is it?
I don't know.
Anyway, let's get.
Oh, give me a second here. There we go.
That aside again. So now we're not going to worry about the internet. We're just going to say that that's going to work. So you have your bank, your credit card processor, your globally distributed infrastructure and DDoS mitigation, and you can now start putting your content out there. If you think that that's a free market, I don't know what to say to you. That is not a free market. The market we have and the infrastructure we have and the internet as we have it today is not a free market. And if you think what I just described is a free market, I don't know that we can have a conversation any further. And if this point that I'm making right now doesn't change your mind, that we don't have a free market and you're still going to tell me it's a free market, let the free market solve the problem, then I will point you to what's currently going on and has gone on not only with Stripe and the Trump campaign or Trump organization, maybe it's not a campaign at this point, I don't know, and Parler, amongst others. Parler right now is off the internet. One, their apps were pulled from all of the corporate oligarchical stores, so you can't get to them from your mobile devices. And then Amazon Web Services took them offline, I think it was last night, and they're just gone. You can't even get to them from a web browser. So if...
I think now's a good time as any to talk about Parler because I've been holding this in for a little bit too long. Parler's a honeypot. I mean, I remember when it was first launched in, I think, 2018 as supposed to be this great conservative alternative to Facebook. And yeah, it was identified as a honeypot pretty quickly. Well, first what was identified is that in order to be on a platform, you have to give your actual name, which itself is also incredibly suspect. You have to give them your personal phone number in order to be able to create an account. They call it two-step authentication, but I think we all know better than that. Next, what you need, and then I remember at some point, I don't know if they still do this, you also needed to give your personal identification so that you could verify that, yes, this is my actual name and this is my actual information to be able to participate on Parler. Now, that itself is just so like, yeah, not only are you voluntarily surrendering any pretense of anonymity on the frickin' internet, but you're also, like, what was it you were going to say?
I was gonna say, hey guys, we're that radical, subversive, centralized platform you've been hearing about in all these news media outlets. Hey, you want to join us? Well, got to give you, because you're obviously a dissenter, am I right? So you got to give us your name, got to give us your phone number, got to give us your social security number, got to give us your driver's license, got to tell us where you live, and we're going to send all that information to our server host, and that's definitely not going to be used by the government to track potentially and to track anti-government narratives or to study narratives brewing in anti-government movements.
This definitely is not going to be selling your information to the highest bidder, and there definitely isn't a portion in their. There definitely is not a part in their privacy policy that says the following: how we use the information we collect. We may use the information we collect for marketing and advertising purposes, such as developing and providing promotional and advertising materials that may be relevant, valuable, or otherwise of interest to you, for compliance purposes, including enforcing our terms of service or other legal rights, or as may be required by applicable laws and regulations or requested by a judicial process or a government agency. That definitely is not a direct quote from their privacy policy. Definitely not. So we know with absolute certainty that they're not going to be giving your personal information over to legislation enforcers, government agencies, or just big data advertising firms. They're definitely never going to be doing that at all. Don't be ridiculous. And don't assume, and also, this definitely is not a honeypot for the purposes of, as Esso said, to collect lists of. I mean, they don't even need to collect lists anymore. All you have to do is just get Parler itself, or get a warrant. You don't even need a warrant. You just tell them, give us a list of all your users, their names, their IDs, and all that stuff. Bam, they make the list for you. It's really freaking easy. I mean, Parler itself was funded and backed by Rebecca Mercer, who is the daughter of Robert Mercer, the hedge fund billionaire, who's heavily involved in a lot of quote-unquote conservative and nationalist causes. So I think that shows you the kind of pedigree of privacy-oriented agorists and crypto-anarchists that we're dealing with here, people who aren't dead at all. So this isn't a subversive platform at all. It's just another form of totalitarian honeypots that are just trying to compete with each other in a form of a Hegelian dialectic kind of narrative.
But as we were arguing, as In-Range TV was arguing a moment ago, well, it's correct. We do not have a free market, and we won't have a free market as long as these political institutions exist that are literally determining prices people can trade around, and are claiming and are setting standards and determining what counts as a just claim to a resource compared to others, and are using that specifically to privilege certain actors at the expense of others. So we don't have a free market. How we get a free market, though, is definitely not to use the very means that have put us into this situation where we don't have a free market.
Yeah, and also another thing that's worth pointing out is his another thing that's interesting is that his identification of a free market is based entirely on not being able to actually identify the extent to which the state prevents people from being able to organize, use their resources, and associate freely. But it's just well, you see, there's all these barriers to entry, and you have to achieve some arbitrary threshold of barriers to entry before it's allowed to be regarded as a free market.
There was this point earlier where he was arguing that, or he was attempting to insinuate that people who are criticizing him, they're the ones who have a ridiculous standard. Motherfucker, you don't even know why what you're arguing would accomplish the ends you're arguing that it would. Shut up.
Anyways, let's go ahead and continue.
There was the best example, I guess, of a free market attempting to create a alternative network. And
I mean, are you really going to try to make the argument that Robert Mercer and his daughter are free market actors and aren't beneficiaries of state privilege, which is how they were able to get their money through their hedge fund in the first place? I mean,
of course
is that
it is, because any argument for protectionism essentially is going to be dependent on the notion that whatever market we're talking about, there's absolutely no way in which the state influenced any incentives or created barriers to entry.
No, it just kind of exists, which actually reminds me of something he said earlier in the video, that without any government regulations, any ism is just going to become tyrannical. which
It's a classic case of Schrodinger's statism. State's great and does everything until there's some aspect of the political infrastructure that everyone's upset at. Suddenly, the state's nowhere to be found.
mhm. I like that term. I should try to remember to use that more often because that's a very classic example here. Very, very prominent with statists trying to defend the role of the state in regards to its intervention in absolutely every aspect of life. Anyways, let's continue.
And it's gone. It's offline. Now, will it be offline permanently? I don't know. Will it ever have the ability to have the reach of something like Facebook? Probably not. But for all of you that said the free market will provide, the free market solves the problem, while I'm not a fan of Parler and I'm not a fan of the kind of content that's been aggregated there, and I think it makes a very clear point, in my opinion, that there is not a free market. So please stop with the free market comments. We do not have a free market. We are past that phase of capitalism to have a free market, at least when it comes to the internet infrastructure and social media and content creation. And therefore, we have to come up with answers that are not based on this mythological concept of a free market that no longer exists. And what I had promoted a long time ago was a digital Bill of Rights. A digital Bill of Rights is, so in theory, we have a Bill of Rights in this country. I'm speaking from Arizona in the United States, in which in the public square, my free speech is permitted. But it's not absolute, and I'll get to that more in a minute. But I have the
reason
right
I
to
can
free
speak is not because I, as a moral agent, have the ability to speak. It's because some people wrote down on a piece of paper that I can.
Pretty much. He's going to be one of those people that
Also,
operates
we're
on
the
the.
ones. Also, we're the ones who have unrealistic standards of reality, heretic.
I guess so. I mean, I forgot that I'm not able to speak until some government bureaucrat decreed that I was able to speak. How is it possible that a bureaucrat who didn't have the right to speak at all and therefore had no ability to speak at all was able to articulate the position that people should be able to speak from just the ether? How is that able to be materialized into existence? Because uh, the state said so.
It's
It's a cult of the omnipotent state in action. You have this belief that rights can just be prescribed onto people, and prior to it, people have no ability to do these things whatsoever. People don't have free will. People don't have autonomy. People aren't ever able to be held responsible for their actions. They're just mere reflections of their circumstances. They're just slaves to their instinct.
or that the state existing doesn't create tangible conditions which could be predicted, and oppression necessarily entailing certain acts. So it for whatever reason would be legitimate to see people being impoverished or people not having access to not having the ability to use their resources in certain ways without being harassed by the state, as though they have nothing to do with state power.
Yeah, it's 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 very hard for me to really get into this because it's like, where do you start? But yeah, he has a very positivist understanding of what rights are and where rights come from. People just need to be told what to say, how to say it, what to think, and you need the government to bestow these rights upon you because in the absence of the government, well, people would just be standing around with their thumbs up their asses waiting for some authority figure to tell them that no, you can do more stuff now because I said so. Anyways, should we continue?
Sure.
free speech. The minute I get onto the internet, because it is quote unquote corporately owned and a free market, suddenly that First Amendment right just vanishes.
Which
like
one is
ether.
it?
It's gone.
Well,
Is there a corporate infrastructure or is it a free market? Keep in mind, corporate entities are a state construct.
yeah, he's not going to be able to say because, well, he just he's just going to go back and forth between that it's corporate and it's a public square. I mean, I'm pretty sure what he's trying to say is that legally it's corporate property, but functionally it is a public square and therefore subject to the protections, quote unquote, from the First Amendment. However, we've already demonstrated very clearly that yeah, that's actually what they want. That's actually what Fang wants. They want to be more heavily regulated. They want to be more heavily restricted because that would make not only that would cement their position as an oligopoly and would pretty much make sure that things like Parler wouldn't even be able to come into existence. That the kind of corporate censorship that is being observed, I shouldn't call it corporate censorship, it's just regular censorship, is just it just would no longer be necessary because those platforms would just simply never be able to come into existence.
They already can't, but yeah, the reason that they even get off the ground for the short period of time that they do is just because, well, the government's got to have a period to actually collect information from people using the platform.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, should we continue?
Yes.
Ethereal. It doesn't matter. It doesn't apply because a corporation can do as it sees fit. Well, I think I've made the argument here that we don't have a free market and therefore the ability.
You actually haven't. I mean, we agree that we don't have a free market. However, our understanding of what a free market is completely not even remotely close. Your understanding of a free market is you need to have an arbitrary levels of barrier to entry that don't need to exist before you're able to compete in an industry. And once you achieve that, once you're below that threshold, you're in a free market. Whereas our understanding of a free market is one that is ethically, or one that exists in a society that is ethically consistent.
Yeah, what even is your standard of intervention? Why is that the way it is? How? These are questions that you either haven't been asked or have never thought of, but in either case, you've never really considered it. And you damn sure haven't even attempted to explain them thus far.
Mm-hmm.
You've just said we don't have a free market. Okay, that's great. Well, why? What informs that claim? Why are you making that claim?
He's making
And
the
what does
claim.
that mean?
He's. I'm just going to go ahead.
Ability for the individual to maintain their free speech rights on this system as it is currently.
Also, I really hate the way that he's framing free speech. He's done this throughout the video. That somehow, depending on where you are location-wise, even in virtual space, that somehow you gain or lose rights, which is entirely consistent with his entirely prescriptive understanding of rights. However, this is also another problem you have with the understanding of, or with the positivist understanding of rights, is that somehow you lose the ability, you lose the capacity to speak, you lose your free will entirely as soon as you travel from one location to another. So, for example, if I were to, I don't know, go from country X, which has a constitution that says you have the right to free speech, and then go to country Y, which is basically North Korea, but minus its constitution. Suddenly, your mouth closes, like just seals shut, the moment that you cross that border. But if you walk back through the border, you suddenly your mouth opens up again, and you're able to speak once more. However, getting back would probably be very tricky because an invisible barrier closes itself off to you the moment you cross that border, because country Y, which is basically North Korea, does not recognize the right for people in its boundary to travel back and forth. So physically traveling back home is simply not possible.
When I do get around to actually writing about this, I'm sure that this is going to be one of those videos I make that causes a spurg fit, especially among self-proclaimed minarchists. But freedom of speech is not itself an ethical concept. The ability to speak is an entailment that exists entirely within the context of what counts as freedom of association. Problems that you start running into when you treat speech as though speech itself is a ethical concept is it starts becoming very fuzzy. There's nothing informing what counts as speech. Not only this, but it becomes kind of fuzzy what counts as a violation to that supposed right, ethical right to speak. Which, keep in mind, ethical principles are supposed to explain what is or is not justified in interactions between one another. If you don't have an idea of what informs a right to speech, you could say, for example, claim that somebody disassociating from you is violating your right to speak, because what counts, and I've seen the sort of culture warrior skeptic crowd make this exact argument, so I'm not even this isn't an argumentum ad absurdum by any means. If you disassociate from somebody, then you're violating their right to speak, because you can't hear what they're saying, and that's what counts as a standard of speech. So it starts, if you treat speech as its own ethical concept, it starts conflicting with other ethical principles, which is which is a big part of the reason why it's incoherent to think of it as itself an ethical principle. Speech is an act; it's not a principle.
Anyways, let's go ahead and continue.
Architect, it is gone, if not in jeopardy, if not completely eradicated. And I believe that a properly written digital Bill of Rights, or something that extends the current Bill of Rights into digital space, would go a long way. It doesn't necessarily affect the rights of a corporation to make profit, but it would change the ability and the way that they actually do their moderation and content control.
Isn't moderation and content control also directly controlled by the state already?
Yeah, or at the very least, the state has it depends on what you're considering moderation to be. Yeah, the state has almost total leverage over moderation policies.
I think I remember 3 years ago that there was a Project Veritas video exposing a lot of people who work for Twitter, and one of the segments was about this Indian guy who was talking about how the reason that a lot of people like what's his name, Julian Assange, were not verified, and it just said like, well, he didn't personally know about that, but he imagined that there was some government official that was just telling them not to do that, and he asked like, does the government tell you to, or does the government control your moderation or make suggestions on how you should moderate your content? And he responds like, oh yeah, all the time. So that's hardly a controversial point, to say nothing of the extent to which the terms of service are often written by government-controlled, ironically named NGOs, and you also have a lot of very incredibly status-controlled think tanks who are involved in the quote-unquote fact-checking of a lot of these sites. Like, wasn't it the Atlantic Council that wrote Facebook's terms of service, or am I thinking of something
Yeah.
else?
Nope, it was the Atlantic Council.
Yeah, and considering how heavily involved that they are with other organizations that are directly involved with the state, like the chambers of commerce, it's not terribly surprising to see that, yeah, the government already has tremendous leverage in what's going on today, in how Google, Facebook, just Bang in general, how that operates, how it's moderated. And so it's the reason that it's structured the way it is currently is because it benefits the state financially. It benefits the state's interest for it to be structured in that current way. Now, you do see a lot of political figures going on mainstream television every now and then talking about how horrible and terrible it is and how they're going to hold Facebook and Twitter accountable. Really, all that is just like one, getting some good sound bites, and two, just fodder for people to make, or fodder for their political supporters to throw them a bone, make them think that the state is still operating in their interest, and that Trey Gowdy is going to get to the bottom of the problem. I promise.
Yeah. Or Josh Hawley really cares about you.
Mm-hmm. I mean,
He definitely doesn't have any vested interests of his own.
Mhm. Trey Gowdy, he tucks me in to sleep every night, so I know he cares.
Trey Gowdy looks like a fucking vampire. It's not even a. That's not even a comforting. That's not even a comforting thought. Like I've referred to him as punchable face Hawley before, but like holy shit! Like out of all of the politicians currently in Congress right now, he fucking just I don't know, something about the way the dude looks just rubs me the wrong way. But then there's of course also the fact that he attempts to use libertarian or at least pseudo libertarian talking points to fist-doom state intervention, and that's going to piss me off too. So
Mm-hmm. So what put him in infamy in my mind is, I remember back when I was a conservatard, he would always do these like great and glorious sound bites about how he was going to get to the bottom of all of these horrible scandals during the Obama administration, how he was going to get into the IRS targeting groups politically, how he was going to get to the bottom of Operation Fast and Furious, get to the bottom of the Benghazi consulate attack, and ultimately nothing ever happened ever.
you talking about Josh Hawley or Trey Gowdy?
Trey Gowdy. That was kind of his thing. Like he was always gonna get to the bottom of everything. He was gonna make sure that everyone who was responsible for all these terrible atrocities, that they were gonna be brought to justice, and that once we get all these bad people out of the government, that everything's gonna be great and wonderful and perfect, and it's gonna be wonderful, and nothing ever happened.
Yeah, I remember that. But do you want to continue? Or
Yeah, let's go ahead.
Content control. So it also would extend to other things, like, for example, the Second Amendment could apply, and in my opinion should apply, as a digital Bill of Rights to malware and hacking tools and security tools and all of those things that I don't think they shouldn't be allowed to be used for illegal purposes or for malicious purposes, but doing that.
How illegal is defined is entirely arbitrary. Although I'm not entirely clear on how you would extend the Second Amendment to malware.
Yeah, that's the confusing part to me. What exactly does that fucking mean? Is he suggesting that it should be is he now arguing within the sort of framework of understanding legal recognition I laid out in my last essay, where something being legally recognized actually puts a tremendous deal of leverage over the person making that claim by the state? So if you have a legally recognized gun, you had to get it from a white market seller, which means you had to at least be involved in the cash nexus. The state has to know, that you have one. The state can manipulate, your incentives as someone who has that resource by manipulating the legal status of guns, quote unquote. And also make it more difficult for people to associate without intersecting with the white market by making the white market more accessible for certain commodities.
Mm-hmm. Ultimately, like the main problem with the internet right now is just there's so much to go into. I mean, we did a video before explaining this in greater detail called "Who Broke the Internet." You can see it on the Backalley. I think it's like 8 months old by now. I'm just guessing, could be different, but yeah, go ahead and check that out if you want to see what's wrong with the internet in more detail. Suffice to say, it's like an onion. The more you peel away and the more layers you get into, the more you want to cry. Especially when you realize like the way that network distribution was done was literally written on 3 napkins as a kind of a kludge fix, and they haven't really updated it since. Kind of like one of those things where it's like you fix it, you know it won't last, you know it's broken as hell, but you do it right now because it's good enough, and you plan on getting a proper fix later. Well, it's been like 30 years and they still haven't fixed it. So, anyways, let's go ahead and continue.
Type of research or doing attempting to crack current encryption solutions to see if they're actually valid or viable or not are things that should not be illegal as long as they're done with the proper intent. So the Second Amendment applies too. In fact, you can kind of take all of the 10 amendments of the Bill of Rights and apply them to the internet and digital space in a very interesting and clever way. And that, in my opinion, is the proper mitigation and proper solution we should be seeking. Another option is to nationalize. Now, I don't promote that. I don't think that's a good idea, because all we're doing then is exchanging one form of control of power for another. It doesn't really matter if it's a corporation's boot, a government's boot, or a religious boot. If it's a boot on your neck preventing you from being able to have legal free speech, then you've got a problem, and nationalizing it just changes who has that power and control. The rebellious version of this would be to completely open source the solution, decentralize it, and go to something that is absolutely uncontrollable. Now, that is the crypto anarchist solution, and I'm wondering if we're going to have no option but that, because this idea of getting a digital bill of rights.
That is literally the only solution.
As I've pointed out, unless you get rid of the infrastructure, the problems we're seeing is always going to exist, and the infrastructure is maintained by political institutions. So that is essentially what that's what we're left with. It's not necessarily what I'd change the phrasing there. It's that's the way forward, to say the least. In order for political organizations to not be able to fuck with the internet, we need to get rid of the infrastructure that allows them to do so by creating something that makes it so it's impossible to do that, to establish this political infrastructure.
And I kind of like how aware he is, at least somewhat, that the crypto anarchist solution is inevitable, because he's saying like that's the only solution we're going to be left with. Yes, literally yes. It's the only option that's viable, and as you said earlier, it's the only option that could really solve these problems for all time. You completely.
I was just gonna say I'm a bit interested to see where he goes with that, because I was through this entire video he was talking as though he wasn't aware that is even a thing.
I'm going to hazard a guess as to what he's going to say, and that he's just going to blow past it as an option and just go on to something else. Because he probably is only obliquely aware of it. He just knows of it, but he hasn't looked into it at all, and as such, his understanding is like, doesn't even qualify as bare bones. It's not existent. Anyways.
It seems pretty far-fetched. Now, interestingly, another video I did quite a...
Well, I guess that's
Seems far-fetched.
On the contrary, it's the most realistic solution that exists. I mean, tell me something. What's more realistic? Open source projects becoming significantly more sophisticated to the point where it's more profitable and more viable for them to be used, that open source projects have greater utility than what could be produced in the white market, or begging your overlords and your corporate overlords to please do something please operate in ways that are completely contrary to their interests and are supporting your interests. What's more realistic? What's more far-fetched?
Yeah, that's probably the reason that people who are watching your content react so poorly. It's because shit like that leaves me into a position where I can't take this any other way than to think that you're arguing in bad faith. You knew about that position throughout your entire video, and so you understood that the approach that you were taking that informs your idea of the internet's infrastructure is both not, agreed upon by every single person, but also that it is in fact an infrastructure problem, and it's an infrastructure problem upheld by the state. Because he also cited Operation Choke Point. So the reason I'd imagine people get so frustrated about this is because it's kind of obvious that you're not arguing in good faith, dude.
Or at the very least, he's trying way too hard to hold onto a position that he knows is untenable. He's probably got some personal thing that otherwise prevents him from being able to look past to see the truth, because if this is true, then this other thing that I personally hold very valuable to be wrong. It's kind of the same thing with what's his name? Rational Outlaw, where he doesn't really have an argument for why the cops are justified, but he has family members who are cops, I believe, so he has to defend them at all costs, because if if cockroaches as a group are wrong and are unjustified in their mere existence, then that means that this uncle, presumably, that he's pretty close with, is not a good person, which is not something he's emotionally willing to accept. So I think it's kind of something similar going on here, where there's some other thing in his personal life that would have to be wrong that he is not emotionally willing to accept, which I think for a good number of statists is a large number of people. However, that still means that they're being dishonest. It's just that, for first and foremost, they're being dishonest with themselves, which, in my opinion, is probably the most tragic part.
Yeah, well, I mean, they're still being, it doesn't matter. They're being dishonest. The means they're employing are dishonest means, but just this sort of context is just sort of explaining why someone might want to be dishonest. I guess because I understand the point you're trying to establish here. A lot of people assume that there are strictly malicious intentions behind it, and that may not necessarily be the case. It may just be for whatever reason someone's pressured into talking about something or feels like they need to address something, but have some sort of personal vested ties into the position that they're defending, and they are being presented with positions that they can't refute. So they, as a way of not of from their perspective, protecting themselves, omit context or to attempt to mislead people through a framework that's rhetorically structured to favor their position.
Hmm. Now, I'm just looking at the comments right now. Lights473 asks, why does Facebook, Google, Twitter, etc. have so much power? We said about this earlier in the stream, and I know you weren't there for it, but I'll just go ahead and repeat what we said. Basically, the government protects them. They're government-backed enterprises, and for reasons that we articulated earlier, there are very much government agencies in name only.
They enjoy positions of political privilege, which people like us don't, and their maintenance costs are externalized through certain privileges as well. And the same barriers to entry which allow this to happen also make it so. Also construct an infrastructure that make it so only certain people who jump through certain hoops that are laid out by the government, licensing standards, connections with the patent office, the FCC, the FTC. They have to do all of that in order to sort of get favor with the government, and even then, the government is going, well, because of that. The government is going to have a tremendous amount of leverage over the financial interests of their firms, because by the time they get there, they have to sell a lot of their assets as stocks because of the fact that they had to associate with some white market banking firm to arrive there. And because of that, not only the government but shareholders have a say in their company policies, and because the political financial infrastructures, credit, interest rates, they're all dictated or at the very least influenced by the Department of Justice and government policy. Which is essential to have a political economy, by the way. The defining trait of a political economy is a monopolized financial system. You can't have a state without a fiat, without a type of fiat or a cash nexus. But because those things exist, the government has a decent amount of leverage in influencing your incentives, what models you can operate around, what you can do with your resources, etc.
Mm-hmm. Don't have much more to add to that. On the plus side, we're almost at the end of the video, so let's go.
Not that long ago, in which I talked about China's control over American media content creation and referred to China as communist, got me a lot of heat about China's, capitalist, and you're crazy, and what's wrong with you calling them this? Except just recently, as in the last couple days, Alibaba, which is a contender to fight with the power of Amazon as a supply chain provider, who, by the way, just before Christmas, used their artificial intelligence, their AI, to prepackage 500,000 packages under the idea that they knew their users so well that they would get it right before the orders were placed, and got it right for 500,000 orders. Let's think about that for a minute on a different day. But anyways, Alibaba's huge.
They're huge, and they got it right. That their prediction algorithm got it right for 500,000 users. How many users does Amazon have? Probably close to 1 billion. And if Alibaba is a competitor that's roughly to the scale of Amazon, getting it right for 500,000 users, if we assume, let's say, 500 million users, it means they only got it right 0.1% of the time. That's nearly.
Yeah, what were you gonna say?
I don't have the actual numbers in front of me, but I'm just going off of what I'm thinking off the top of my head. And if the 500,000 or 500 million number is accurate, then yeah, 0.1% accuracy is not something worth bragging about.
But also, is the point that he's attempting to make here that economic planning is possible? Because this is exactly why, because, you know, this isn't related to the rest of the claims in the video, but this is exactly why we don't talk about economic theory as a prescriptive standard, because you're studying actual social, you know, human social interaction. The problem there that creates is it is literally impossible to predict human interaction. Not just it's, you know, it's complicated, or, you know, there are a lot of variables that you have to take into consideration. It's that some of the variables you have to take into consideration make it conceptually unjustifiable to even look at economic principles as though they can be demonstrated through creating some sort of model. For instance, how people process information, like how they internalize it and how they choose to act on it relative to their environment, and you know, how they internalize their environment, what, you know, what information is even being internalized. Somebody can, you know, what counts as internalizing information. Somebody can look at a tree, but, you know, they're not actually thinking about the tree. They're in their own headspace daydreaming. So if you ask them, you know, ask them about the tree later, they won't be able to recall anything because they were lost in their own head.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, sorry, I'm a bit distracted at the moment.
First of all, I don't know what that has to do with the point of the video, but as far as the actual, if that's what's being insinuated, that's a big bruh moment.
He's also trying to, I mean, is he going to try to make the argument that because China exists, there's no free market? I mean, yeah, I don't think it's controversial, but not for the reasons that I'm certain that he's not going to articulate here. It's just like,
I'm genuinely curious, so let's see what his reasoning is, or what the point of bringing that up was.
It's another Amazon. And what did China just recently do? They nationalized them. They essentially took over a private corporation, which I think is ostensibly an interesting quote to have such a thing in China, and turned it into a national resource. That's another solution. Boy, that's a bad one. Like I said, you're changing one form of control and power for another. So I'm not for that. I'm for a digital Bill of Rights. I'm for recognizing that the internet is a public sphere of conversation and it's the public square. I am for recognizing that there is not a free market. I think some of the antitrust stuff going on kind of like touches on this, but doesn't really touch on it the way it needs to be. And we need to be pushing for the Bill of Rights to extend into digital space and cyberspace, because the reality is the current real world and the internet aren't different. They are one of the same.
We need to come up with a term to describe that argumentative tactic that statists use, as a way to shift the goalpost, or as a way to pretend that what they're advocating for isn't what their critics are claiming, or what they're advocating would avoid that. Essentially, it's stating their conclusion as though that's the means that they're arguing, as a way to avoid having to deal with means and ends consistency. We'll see this a lot in like the minimum wage debate, for example. I'm talking about people having their living standards increased and getting more money. No, you haven't proven that that's what you're arguing. What you're arguing is that the government should should make it illegal to hire people at certain rates, or that the government should plan in the labor market. And what you're trying to argue, that you could argue that is the case, but you have to demonstrate why that's the case. And that's what he's doing here. Well, I'm arguing for platforms being neutral and there being a Bill of Rights. Well, no, you're not arguing for platforms being neutral. That's the conclusion that you're claiming you'll reach, but you haven't demonstrated that.
All they're really demonstrating is that he's going to make it illegal for platforms to engage in certain behavior that he personally does not like. Which it's hard to tell. It's impossible to say if that's ever going to be anything that resembles neutral or not, simply because one person's idea of neutrality is going to be completely different than another. I mean, we've had this situation before with something I'm pretty sure he would at least be obliquely aware of. I'm just assuming, called the Fairness Doctrine. I don't know if you are aware of that.
I do. Yeah, I'm aware of it. I remember you mentioning it in previous essays.
Yes. That's something I'm absolutely certain that he is going to be familiar with. The idea was that the federal law required news and just media in general, when they're stating a political opinion, to give fair coverage and equal amount of time to both sides. However, which side or which of the other sides was considered to be the other side, as well as what was considered to be a singular position, was arbitrarily determined by the state, to the point where it was in mainstream media's incentive to only state things as quote-unquote neutrally as possible. And of course, since what was neutral was determined by the state, you basically had several decades of entirely state unskeptic narratives being spun, put forward by the media and the news media as though it were objective truth.
Yeah, but we've been going on for about 3 hours, and that's the end of the video, so...
I mean, there's still a little bit of the video left, but we can probably call it here if you want.
Yeah, I want to write a bit more on the video that I've been working on. On top of that, it's starting to get kind of late here, so
I understand.
I would like to wrap it up, but did you have anything that you wanted to say, Heretic?
No, not particularly. Say that this is just retreading a lot of the points that we talked about like 2 or 3 years ago, back when net neutrality was starting to become a hot topic again. And it's just following the exact same fallacies that we talked about before. This assumption of Schrodinger's statism, as you coined, to assume that the state simply does not exist in a sphere where the state is actually incredibly powerful and prominent, somehow thinking that there is something that even resembles a free market in any industry, let alone the internet, as well as the belief that somehow FANG does not consist entirely of government agencies.
All right.
So,
but
yeah.
Anyway, I guess we'll thank you all for watching. We'll see you on the Friday or Saturday stream. But before we go, I would just like to shout out the next week's stream, which is going to be that Hoppian debate that we've been hyping up over the last couple months. Yeah, the midweek stream next week's finally happening. It's finally happening.
I'd actually be a little cautious because we haven't settled on a time or schedule yet. We're still working out, time and stuff. But yeah, hopefully.
Well, one of them mentioned next Tuesdays, and we all seem to have agreed. But
yeah, we'll have to finalize on that. But we'll definitely talk. We'll definitely mention if it's concrete on Friday's stream for sure. Yeah, the Hoppian debate's finally happening. So yeah, get hype.
All